Welcome to episode 88 of Webflail. I'm your host, Jack, your failure connoisseur, and today my guest is Stephen Wise. Now, he's a fascinating guy I've been following for a while. He's a creator, an entrepreneur. He writes about all sorts of different theories. He's a big reader, but he started as a freelance web designer and now transitioned to Demandflow. A couple of years ago in 2022. He now has 7 people in the agency, 4 people full-time, 3 contractors, and that scales depending on the project, which we'll get into today. So he's flying high, working with all sorts of different clients on retainers, but has it always been easy? Of course not, guys. We're going to be talking about 3 different failures. Failure number 1, the 3-week project that turned into 3 years. The failure number 2, ignoring the scary S word. Do you guys know what that S word is? You'll find out very soon. And failure number 3, focus, focus, focus. So, Stephen, welcome to the Webflail podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
I am very excited to chat with you. I was watching your YouTube videos this morning, put out a ton of content. We'll talk about all of that in a second. I'm getting excited. The first question I want to ask you is, what is your relationship with failure?
I kind of see myself as like a crash test dummy most of the time. Is like I've been freelancing, kind of running a service business for 6 years. So since I turned 18, like the day I turned 18, I quit college, tried to figure out how to make a living online. Most of that time has been as a freelancer. Once I eventually kind of fell into web design and development, I feel like I've made every single mistake there is to make, which it doesn't sound great, but at least there's a wealth of experience in a short period of time. So yeah, I feel like my experience with failure is often, it's regular.
But you deal with it. You know, I watched one of the videos that you did about basically how you kind of went through like playing a load of Xbox and then just being like, what am I going to do with my life? And then like, you know, started doing a lot of reading, 4-hour work week. A lot of people have spoken about that on the podcast and how that book was a big life changer for them. But then you just kind of careered into stuff, as far as I can tell, and just took everything in your stride, which has got you to where you are. So no regrets on the failures that you've had. Is that fair?
Yeah. So I think the thing with like any failure is that when you zoom out, when you continue doing the thing, like when you zoom out on the kind of longest time scale, it all looks very good. It all looks like, okay, this, go from this position where, 18, like nothing, to now having an agency or whatever it is that someone does. It all seems great. In the moment, it doesn't seem great, especially not in the like the early days when you're failing consistently and you're like trying as hard as possible. And all you're doing is like, you're running a project, you think everything's going to be great on this project. Then, you run into issues. Maybe you kind of don't end up like working out on that project. Maybe like you kind of have to fire the client or whatever it is. So I think the biggest thing is just this ability to zoom out and realize, okay, I may be like failing here. Like there may be something going wrong. When I kind of jump into work later today, I'm sure there'll be a fire inside of Slack that's like feels like a failure, like something's gone wrong. But it's like this ability to kind of like cope over a longer period of time and figure out, how do I just like keep going and then just keep iterating. So yeah, I think that's like the way I view it, is that it all seems good in hindsight, but in the moment, not so good.
Yeah, I think there's this kind of glorification of like different stages that ended up at Demandflow, and so obvious. Like we failed here, but we learned from it. We failed here, but in the moment, you're like, fuck. Like there's like a client that sends you an email, and you're just like, oh my god, my life is over. But that level-headedness that you talked about, that ability to kind of just, okay, there's a problem, let's think about different solutions, let's execute that solution type thing. I think that it's like a muscle, right? Like after you've kind of gone through enough fires, you've got quite callous skin and you can kind of deal with it, to use a very weird metaphor.
That doesn't come naturally to me as well. Like I am very much like the entrepreneur who goes on the roller coaster, like up and down. That is like one of those things where there's certain like levers that I pull in my life where it just helps me. Like, for example, like exercising every day, just all these things where you just make, I almost like have to make my personal life more difficult in terms of like exercise and these challenges, like where you're reading, you're doing things to try and improve, just because it makes everything else seem really small. Like a really great book I read a while back. It's called Endurance, and it's this guy Shackleton who was on like this voyage, and they got stuck for like months in, I think it was the Arctic, and they very like everyone, well, pretty much everyone came back. They all survived. This is like in the 1800s, and it's like reading about things like that puts my life into perspective when there is like this tiny little thing in the agency that's like, oh no, this tiny thing inside of Webflow was slightly incorrect. It's not as big of a problem when you kind of like look at it in this kind of lens.
I absolutely love how you've put that. Do you know about the Shackletons advert that men wanted for a hazardous journey?
Yeah.
This, okay. Can I read it out? Is that all right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, go for it.
Okay, I just think that really, this might help. If you are listening and you are currently in a fire with a client, in fact, if you are listening to this podcast, the fire is probably not that big, but let's read this out anyway. The advert is men wanted for hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return, doubtful, honor and recognition in case of success. Ernest Shackleton. So just to put it into context, when we're talking about perspective, when we're talking about failures, this guy puts this advert out, gets an overwhelming response, like the craziest response. And apparently it's one of the greatest ads of all time. But essentially what we're trying to say is that the failures that you are currently facing in your little digital world, just remember that in the grand context, your fire may feel like a furnace at the time, but actually in the grand scheme, you can deal with it. You'll get through it. If Ernest Shackleton can get loads of men to come with him to the Arctic, then, you know.
Yeah, you can close your laptop and just try forget about it.
Yeah, you can deal with it. You can close your laptop. You can do whatever. You've got that luxury. Yeah, how you approach failure or how you see failure determines how you ride through it and how you can get to success, whatever success is to you. Speaking of what success is to you, Stephen, you were a freelancer. Then you started Demandflow. What happened? What changed for you?
Yeah, so there's this kind of point where I initially started freelancing. It took quite a while. I would say like 2 years until I was steady as a freelancer, where it was like every day working on stuff. And then I actually kind of started to feel a bit more confident, like I was earning a decent amount. And then in that year, it got to like a decent level of income. And I was kind of just like comfortable was probably the best word. It's like I was just in this zone where I was comfortable. I didn't know whether I wanted to scale an agency. I didn't really kind of know exactly what I wanted to do. I had a few different false starts. So I tried to, I think my company is evolved under many different names. A lot of those were me just as a sole trader, just as an individual, trying to maybe work with freelancers, trying to understand this stuff. There was a lot of things that I didn't like about the idea of an agency, but more than anything, that wasn't through experience of an agency. It was just the idea of what an agency is and having to manage people. I very much drunk the Kool-Aid of like solopreneurship quite early on when people were Paul Jarvis's company of one, even though technically it doesn't, the book is not actually about building a company of one person, but like I very much kind of bought into that kind of idea of being like solo. Then once I started like the first few times with trying to hire people, trying to hire contractors, I made a lot of mistakes and kind of pulled away from trying to grow. Then I was going back to freelancing and I realized, okay, the way I think I've noticed is very different to someone who is like specific to a skill. So someone who is very like, I'm a developer or I'm a designer. The way I think is actually quite a lot more like an entrepreneur. Like I noticed there's a lot more like, okay, I want to build a business. Like, you know, I listen to business podcasts. I listen to all these kind of things. Like I want to figure that stuff out. So I was like, well, when I made the decision to do this, I was kind of just turning 23 when I kind of fully made the decision to build Demandflow. So I was like, well, this is probably the best time to learn how to build a business and make all these like mistakes, make all these failures that you're going to kind of experience doing this thing. So that was really the catalyst, was that I knew I wanted to build a business. I didn't know realistically what business to build because obviously I already built like a service business as a freelancer, but I wanted to figure out, okay, how can you hire people? How can you kind of like build something bigger than yourself? How do you build a brand as well? So that was really the catalyst. Was I knew I wanted to build something. I didn't know what that thing was. So the best place to probably learn is the place I already have like an unfair advantage.
Okay, that makes sense. And what is it about entrepreneurship that excites you? Like, say someone's listening to this and they're like, God, yeah, I really resonate with what Stephen's saying. Maybe I want to build something bigger than just my freelance business. Like, what turns you on about entrepreneurship?
Yeah, I think the thing for me has always been the freedom piece, and that's the reason why I quit college. That's the reason why I do any of this stuff. Is I just like hate the idea of like the default path and just doing things like the default way, which basically every decision that I end up making, like I try think through and then just be like, okay, this is like what society does, like the just like the plain way of doing things. How can I like is that a good way of doing things, or how can I maybe improve how I operate, like the things that I do, just to kind of fit my like what I like, the things I want to do. So for me, the kind of benefit and the allure of entrepreneurship is like a few different points. The main one is freedom, because I just very much like being able to earn my own money, control exactly how I spend my own time, and just do things on my own terms. I'm also not very good at like getting orders from people and like executing on those orders. I'm very much like I like to think about trying to do something and then figure out and close that gap, which does come down to being quite stubborn. And that's partly the reason the path that I've taken. Sometimes I don't recommend taking the exact path for other people, because the only reason I think it worked for me is because I'm just incredibly stubborn, which kind of ends up being like the crash test dummy who keeps making these mistakes and just keeps going. So that's like the one thing, is the freedom piece. The other thing is like just having like a larger impact. Something I've noticed once I've started building Demandflow is I very much enjoy working with people, giving people the opportunity to kind of excel in a role and grow in that role, and just become someone who, when they first start working with me and first start working with the company, they go from like the entry point to being very, very good at what they do. And I think the longer term goal for me ultimately is like a flywheel of companies, essentially, or like different things I'm interested in. So I can have like my, I guess the phrase is like hand in a bunch of different pies. But ultimately, it's like I'm just interested in a lot of stuff. So what I'm trying to build towards here is, okay, how can I use like being a specialist in one place, build up this kind of, let's call it like an empire, a business, like something very profitable to live this free life, and then have the ability to explore with different projects. Like, you know, when you run a studio like this, you could build like website projects and try run like affiliate marketing or what, like a content site or anything like that. And then the other piece I'm very interested in is the actual content side of things, like YouTube and things like that.
Awesome. I think it's the summary for me is like working out what freedom looks like to you, what success looks like to you, and then kind of doubling down on that. And it sounds like you've already got this skill set in web design and web development. It made sense to naturally start there. And you can also see so many problems when you're a web designer or a web developer. You're like, oh my God, there's business opportunities everywhere. And if that's something that obviously you're interested in, it's like, God, wow, there's rich pickings.
Exactly. You see a lot of people who maybe make like a similar shift to where I'm trying to like go, who, because you get exposure, like with the type of clients we often work with are tech startups or just startups in general, people building businesses. And a lot of the time, the fun thing is to work with founders who are growing things, like the kind of people I get on with really well. But you're just exposed to so many different problems, and there's so many different industries that you learn about that you don't know before you start working with these clients. Like, you know, it could be the most random niche, and you realize this is a really big business, but you wouldn't think like every day that this is even something that happens. So more than anything, it's kind of like seeing how the sausage is made, and then understanding like in the larger ecosystem of the world, like there's all of these different pieces and there's all of these different opportunities. But yeah, I would say like the thing I'm most interested in is like just opportunity. It's like, okay, can you make something out of nothing and like see all of this different kind of like interesting stuff that is happening?
Makes a ton of sense. See how the sausage is made is a phrase I haven't heard in this context, but that makes a ton of sense. Tell me about, in the context of making something from nothing, all your content. You are a bit of a machine when it comes to content. You've got your YouTube channel, you've got a website with articles, you've got the Sunday Filter newsletter, which is excellent, by the way, if you haven't signed up to that. Always interesting thoughts and theories that are being condensed into bite-sized nuggets. But why is content a big deal for you? Why do you put so much effort into that?
So content for me is probably the main thing that I kind of fell in love with in terms of building businesses and like the internet in general. For me, that was always YouTube, especially when I was young at this kind of phase where I was starting to build a business, or even just before building the business. One thing that's been really nice actually over the last few years is we've worked with a few different creators. So some of these people who used to like watch on YouTube ended up working with them, which is like a really nice place to be. But for me, I find content just like one of the most interesting things, but also one of the most fun things to do. So I very much just like spending like a morning just writing and then also making videos. Like that's something I kind of fell into. I would say my consistency isn't quite there. It was never there when I was a freelancer. It was always like spurts of like, oh, I'll write a bunch of articles and I'll make some videos. And then I end up getting kind of like, there's a bunch of client work I need to do. And then I'm just not very consistent with this stuff. But what has happened just over the course of consistently being kind of interested and trying to do this stuff over a long period of time is that I've built like foundational skills in these kind of things. One thing with the video side of things is something I'm very interested in and something I'm focused on more now. Now got a video editor. It's like a full-time video editor. So that then is going to help with actually making content. The main thing is like freeing myself up in the business to actually spend time and concentrate on that stuff. So yeah, content to me is like that kind of thing where it's permissionless and it's just so leveraged. You know, you create something. One of the best examples, like none of my videos have ever really gone like particularly huge. Like there's nothing there that's amazing. But there was a video maybe 2 or 3 years ago I created because I wanted to work with a YouTube creator called Matt Diavella. I created a website. I created a video, which was really bad. It was like one of the first videos I ever made. It makes me cringe so much when I watch that back. It is so bad, but I keep it there because I feel like it's a valuable lesson. If someone sees that, they'll see, okay, this is a really bad video, but this did actually open an opportunity for me. So I created a strategy document as well. I just tagged him on Twitter with all this stuff, said, I'd love to work with you. Like 2 days later, we were on a call and we ended up working together. Those kind of things, like completely permissionless, the amount of leverage you can get from doing content, from doing this kind of thing is crazy. Even a video I created a while back, maybe like 3 years ago now, on getting started as a Webflow developer and designer is, you know, in the grand scheme of YouTube, it's not huge. It maybe has like 50,000, 60,000 views, but there's consistently people who message me or when we went to the Webflow event who said, oh, I know you from this thing, or like, thanks for that video. Like it helped me get started or whatever it is. This kind of stuff is crazy that's the ability to do this. In the past, you'd have to be on TV to be able to do this stuff. Now you can literally just get your phone, put it on the internet and like, you know, theoretically, like millions, billions of people can see the content that you create.
Yeah, crazy stuff can happen. Do Webflowers or should Webflowers be making content in your opinion?
I think it really depends on the individual. I think that, you know, if it's like your kind of, well, I would say personality, but then like I'm as an individual, I'm not an outgoing person who is like, oh, you'd think this person's like an entertainer or anything like that. For me, I'm just very interested in stuff. So one part is personality, is like, are you interested in this stuff? I guess the other side is business. Like if you know, you need a presence because ultimately, you know, you're a freelancer or whoever you are, like if you're a designer, you're a Webflow developer, or you do both, you're only really as valuable as the amount of people who know your valuable skills. So everything like this is kind of the way I see it is like top of funnel. So top of funnel is awareness. It's like how many people know about who I am and what I do. And then everything kind of goes down the funnel to the point where like that's a client who wants to work with you. But if you can do this stuff and, you know, there's so many different formats of this, like creating content to some people would be these like long form YouTube videos, which are a ridiculously heavy lift. And sometimes I don't think people realize, like, if you want to properly edit a YouTube video, it is like crazy amount of work. Then there's obviously like other formats like, you know, Twitter or LinkedIn or just sharing visuals in different places. Is like, I think there's so much value in choosing at least one place to focus in and really just use it as like an exposure kind of mechanism to make sure you have a consistent work coming in.
Yeah, and top of funnel awareness. I actually spoke to someone the other day about this, and they said, I just want to do the work. And
yeah,
what I think is interesting that there's this kind of fetishization of freelance life, right? And frankly, being a freelancer does involve a lot of different skill sets, especially when you're starting out. You know, you're trying to get awareness because no one is aware. You're trying to learn the craft. You're trying to get clients and try and learn on the job and like all of this stuff. And actually, I think if you're just someone that wants to do the thing, not necessarily do all the putting yourself out there, creating content and stuff, I think actually getting an in-house role or an agency role is actually quite a powerful option. So just to piggyback on what you're saying, I think it does depend on you as an individual, and you don't necessarily need to be like twerking on TikTok with a Webflow logo on your ass and stuff. Like, and obviously content can be whatever you want it to be, but you don't need to think, oh God, ick, I don't want to make content. Why do I want to make content? I just want to do the
exactly.
work, and that's fair if that's you. Sorry.
I think that's a huge part, is like the idea of like living a freelance life is so appealing. Being an entrepreneur, like building your own business is so appealing. But I don't think most people are necessarily like should be doing it or cut out for it, because there is so many things that you have to do where you have to be okay with being kind of cringe. Like if you're trying to build something, you're trying to like, start on YouTube, do content. That first stuff is going to be so incredibly cringe, but it's also not going to be the work that you want to do. It's not going to be sat inside a Webflow. Like my job now, not that much of it is actually inside a Webflow anymore, or fully designing. Like I am doing bits and pieces, but if I wanted to just do that, I would be much better working in-house at a good company who gives me, freedom to just do these things on my own time and have like the benefits. But ultimately, if you want to do the work, getting a job is not a bad thing to do the
Yeah.
work. It's a very different kind of a different lens. If you're a freelancer, you're doing everything. If you're an entrepreneur and you're trying to build a business with multiple people, your exposure to risk is very high, because obviously you have to pay people, but then you're trying to delegate these different areas. But if you're an employee, you're just doing the thing that you want to be doing. You're getting time to just like focus on that thing.
Yeah, definitely. And also, if you're someone that wants to work in a team, and like there's plenty of advantages to working in house, because sometimes I feel like maybe I talk about like freelancing, and that maybe is too much of a focus of Webflail. So someone called me out on that the other day. So thank you. You know who you are. Okay. We are now going to dive into your failures. Are you ready to talk about failure number one?
I am.
Tell me about failure number one, the 3-week project that turned into 3 years.
So this is a project quite early on in my Webflow journey of being a designer and a developer. So when I first started out, I initially jumped into Squarespace and WordPress, which are the two that I kind of learned. So the way I very first kind of jumped into freelancing as a designer and developer was that I'd built a bunch of blogs and these kind of like tried to build affiliate sites and all this kind of stuff very early on. So I knew how to do those two things. About kind of a year and a half in, I found Webflow, and it was very quick between this kind of like whole process of me jumping very kind of like headfirst into Webflow, because I understood that the kind of people I wanted to work with would work with Webflow, because there were startups, there'd be marketing teams, like there'd be these companies trying to grow. So I went headfirst into Webflow. But at this point, like let's say I must have been kind of 12 months in, or maybe kind of between 12 and 18 months into the journey. A lot of my projects weren't particularly that big. They were kind of like these bitty projects where someone wants me to go into Squarespace and do a little bit of custom code, or like set up this WordPress site using like the Divi builder or whatever it was. But then I'd gone into like Webflow full on, and I was like, okay, I'm just going to specialize in Webflow. This is going to be like my platform. Side note, that was a very good decision. Like however many years later that has been. But with this project, I think it was actually possibly on Upwork. It looked very interesting. It was maybe about, I think this project was possibly about 4 or 5 grand, and I was like, oh, this is cool. Like it's a very interesting project. Like it sounded very appealing. It sounded something like I'd be interested in. It wasn't exactly my target market. It was more of like a personal project. It was a travel website. So I very kind of scoped this thing out. I was like, okay, got on a call with this person, and I was like, oh, this seems like a lot of fun, to be honest. Like it seemed like a good challenge inside of Webflow, and I did learn a lot from the project. The problem I found was that this project was someone's personal project. So they were paying out of pocket for this build. They didn't have a business. They had ideas that they eventually wanted to turn this into a business. But then this creates this tension because it's like a personal project. The person feels like, well, they are spending their own money, which then means that they're very kind of like overbearing on the project in terms of, this like constant input. It's very hard to get like feedback because they're very emotional on the project, because like it is their baby, which, in some senses can be fine. Like you can work on projects with founders and, they understand in that context, they are trying to build something that makes money. But with this, it was very much like a pet project. And the project went like relatively well, even though we had these like slight problems. But then right near let's say we got to the point where we were just about to launch, there kept being these like weird things that this person would flag up. And I was like, I don't really understand what's happening here. Like the scope was changing. It was like they wanted to do different things. They kept redesigning things. And I was like, okay, but we're going to have to requote if we want to add extra pages or whatever it was that we were going to do. But for context, this was definitely the most complex CMS project I'd done in ever at that point. There was like, I think maybe 5 or 6 different CMS template pages we were using, and we were like linking them all together. This was quite early days, like FinSuite, when you used to have to add custom code in rather than attributes to like combine collection lists and things like that. And then one day, like they just stopped replying, like completely. Like we just never got, like I never got a reply back from them. I kept like sending messages like every couple of weeks, but nothing happened. And then like I was just like, okay, well, they've paid up to a certain point. I'm now like close to delivering this site, but they disappeared. And then over the course of the next essentially 3 years from this point, every, let's say, 8 to 10 months, they'd pop back in and be like, let's get this live. Like, can we finish this project? And then we'd start, like, I'd go through it, I'd start working with them on it, and then they'd just disappear again. And this was like the first experience I think I ever had with a client disappearing. Obviously, you are owed money as well because like the final payment for the project hadn't been done, but at the same time, I'd never delivered the project to them. And this was just like the weirdest thing because you kind of in this limbo phase. I also initially, because they have a domain for this, like I helped them set up their Google Workspace stuff. So it was just like very messy when things needed to be renewed. And that was often the point when they'd come back to me when it was like, there's a problem with my workspace because like I actually had the domain in my account. There's a problem with this because the domain hasn't been renewed. And I was like, you disappeared. I'm not going to renew the domain because, there's no point. You just disappeared from here. Eventually, the solution I just found with this was they came back like one more time. So this must have been like the 5th time they came back. I just said like they wanted to get this live. That was like one of the main points where I've just fired a client to the extent where I was like, I don't want any money from here. I'm going to transfer everything over to you. I'm going to give you an overview of the project so you can see this is exactly how these things were built. Also gave context to, obviously, when I build something 3+ years ago, it's going to look very different because the Webflow ecosystem looks different now. So there wasn't, client first or any, like a lot of these class systems. And so I did this. I sent over the site to them. Like I said, just set up an account here. I sent over the site, and now I just kind of like canceled the project and cut my losses with this one. Because it was a bit of a nightmare, a bit of a kind of like a weird situation.
Oh, this whole story annoys me. Oh, that's so frustrating. They're like an abusive partner. They just come back to say the right thing at the right time, and you're like, maybe we're gonna finish this project.
Yeah,
and then
get my hopes up every time.
Yeah, and then they ghost you. That's obscene. I mean, okay, if you are now in this situation, how would you have gone back and dealt with this differently? Would you have said, look, we've got to this point, you disappeared, you've come back. I think what we should do is you pay me the rest of the money now, and then I'm going to finish the project and I'll transfer everything over to you if you are, if you like put your money where your mouth is type thing. Or how would you have dealt with it differently looking back?
Yeah, so the way I should have dealt with this was the very first point they came back. That should have been the point where I basically had like an ultimatum exactly like that. It was like, okay, we're either going to finish this now, get it live, or when like this project is cancelled. It's something that we have kind of added into our kind of terms of service is this ability to be like, okay, if you don't reply after a certain period of time, I think we have it about like a month or so. It's like 4 weeks. At that point, the project is dormant. At that point, anything that we're owed, we can request. But like the project has turned dormant, we can then like restart we can get the project going again. But it's like it's on our terms, like it's our kind of like
You'll decide when
we're
to
in charge
work on
of
it.
that. Mm-hmm. Exactly, because like if someone comes back in 6 months' time, you might be working on a bunch of other projects. Like it's impossible for them to just be like, oh yeah, I need that now. Like let's just do this thing. The project price should change theoretically. Like we're not going to do that because obviously it's really awkward to kind of like have to maneuver like a project price and all that kind of stuff. But ultimately, it should change if they've just kind of somewhat wasted a huge period of time where you've had to at least think about this project, and now they're just like, yeah, do it right now. So yeah, we would definitely approach it in that way, where it's like at that first point, that would be the ultimatum. Like that would be the point where it's like, we're making a decision here. Like everything's going to happen now, or it's not going to happen, because at the end of the day, like a project going over this period of time, while I wasn't thinking about it in the day to day, it was ultimately something where like there was technically an unpaid invoice that was kind of just waiting. There's a website in the background that's kind of just sat there doing nothing. Like there's a lot of pieces to this that kind of you shouldn't necessarily be dealing with. So yeah, I think cutting ties at that point, or like getting it done at that point, would be something that I would focus on a lot now.
Okay, was this why Demandflow became partly why Demandflow came into play as well with the retainer-based model? Because I think a lot of people listening might be like, yep, I did an upfront project. I thought it was a great gig if we did the project on time, but obviously the project massively ran over, scope creep happened. You know, you need to turn into a diplomat when you just want to be designing and creating. So tell me about the retainer model and the thought behind that, and how that might have been influenced by this project.
Yeah, so throughout the process, we've kind of trialed a bunch of different models as we go. So currently, we don't actually just like, say if we have a new project, we don't push people onto a retainer or anything like that. What we do is we do still do scoped projects. The main thing, and that is like almost like the initial engagement with a client is a scoped project. It's like it's often a new build or a redesign and branding and like all these different pieces depending on what the client needs. The retainer side of things is more on the back end. If the company is growing as like a startup, they'll often have a marketing team. And what we find with that retainer side of things is if they have a marketing team, often the marketing team will not be technical enough to design and build well on their marketing website that's inside of Webflow. But the product team, so the product developers and the product designers, are so busy doing the product that the marketing team kind of have like no one to help them. So our retainer model is like, that's how we think about that side of things. The way that we'd kind of counteract a project like this happening again with our scoped projects, first of all, if it's someone's personal project, I'm pretty much not going to take it on unless there's a solid, like there's a business plan there, like there's a model to make money. This is the kind of thing where it's like your personal projects are for doing yourself. I feel, especially if you're in this space, like you can do your own personal projects. Like I'm not going to get paid by someone to build a personal project again. The other thing is like covering your back with like terms of service and like being, okay, once this happens, here is like a process for this, which is very difficult when you start out because, you're not exposed to all these things. It's impossible to have processes and ways of dealing with things when you've never experienced it before.
Awesome. Okay. Thoreau Renarsson from Snowhouse Studios, he told me a similar thing when I had him on the podcast. He basically said that they will do a kind of trial period for a set fee, and then, they can then go into the retainer if it's a good relationship on both sides and it makes sense, or there's a very, very clear plan as to, what this ongoing relationship is going to look like with, do you have a business plan? Like, what are you, are you scaling? Like, how do you foresee the business developing and stuff? So I think that's really important. Yeah.
With the way we see retainers is like, if working with us is not going to at least double the amount of money you earn, we don't want to work on a retainer with that company, because it's like, eventually it just becomes an expense. Like working with us on a retainer basis should be this investment, because they get with the Demandflow, like having a team of designers, developers and everything, is like what we should offer is more kind of talent than they can bring in-house at a similar price. So they have the ability to work with us who are like specialists in this thing. They probably don't have the need to hire someone full time, because then they'd just be inventing work for this person. So it's like, that's the thing. It's like, we at least want to be doubling the money we make for them. But in a lot of cases, it's even more than that, because if this is a growing company, the amount of traction, that comes for a site, like, some of the sites we're working on, there's like we're hitting kind of like 1 million visitors a month on some of these things. It's like, this is very important that this traffic is optimized and it is bringing them in more revenue. So yeah, for us, it's more kind of retainer client fit than anything. And we don't want to work with a small client on a retainer like this, because it doesn't make sense if they're not making kind of enough money from it.
You're not going to retain them. that doesn't, it's like that, and they don't want to be retained. So you spoke like a true salesman there, Stephen. I would hire you in an instant,
It's something I've noticed I've enjoyed a lot recently is this kind of like sales process in the Webflow space. Now, I don't see myself as like a salesy kind of person. Like I said, I'm not very outgoing. I'm interested in things, and I think that's the reason why I like selling it, like this kind of sales process in the web design and development space, because I'm interested in this stuff, so I want to talk to people about it. So it's like if they have a problem, all we're doing is we're going through and solving the problem and saying, here's how we'd help you with this thing, and like here's past experiences and like the different things we can do here. So this is something I've noticed recently is I actually kind of enjoy the sales, but I think it's very dependent on this thing.
Yeah, no, I'm not. Just to be clear, I'm not trying to say you're kind of like a car salesman, wheeler dealer. When I say the word salesman, I think a lot of people have a problem with the word sales, but I'm not trying to suggest that that's you're kind of like one of these. Yeah,
I take it as a compliment.
Yeah, no, I think basically what I'm trying to say is that you are very clearly presenting the case that it's an investment and not a cost for the client, and if it's not, then you will tell them that, which probably makes them a massive Demandflow advocate and maybe even want to work with you more, even though you're like, look, we're not a good fit. We're not a good fit because we want to double your money. No, sorry, I'm putting on the silly American
like
voice.
if we don't tell them, they'll find out. We'd much rather we tell them
Black and white
than they find out after giving us a bunch of money.
Hey, take my money, Stephen. Take my money. Tell me about failure number 2, ignoring the scary S word. God, this is very relevant.
Yeah, this flows in very well. So when I was a freelancer, I would say it was very easy to get by just doing good work. Once I got to the point where I had some clients, so you get a few lucky breaks when you're earlier in terms of like you try everything you possibly can. You throw a lot of spaghetti at the wall. You eventually get some projects that you're like, oh, this is a good project. I like working with this client. We can work with them over a long period of time as a freelancer. And doing good work, you'll get referrals. Like that's the best way to get business in this industry is through referrals. It's always the strongest thing. It happens. There's clients we worked with, and I worked as a freelancer like 4 or 5 years ago, who will still refer people now, even though we haven't worked with them in a really long time, because people ask, do you know anyone who's good at this thing? If they say, oh, we work with this company and I liked working with this company, that's like you've basically made the sale. Like if they only get one recommendation, as long as you don't really fumble on the call, like you basically made the sale, as long as like your pricing's decent. So one thing as a freelancer is I think I didn't really focus on having a process for marketing myself and doing sales. Like I did some content, I was posting on social media and things like that. Even asking for referrals every so often, I think that's a very, very important thing to do. Until I got to the point where I decided to build Demandflow, which is, ultimately when I started thinking about this, I would say it's about 2 years ago. I really didn't, I kind of avoided sales, the scary S word, sales and marketing as much as possible, and just kind of like put my head down and was like, I'll just do great work, and that great work will mean I get more work. And that work's scaling to a certain point. You can have a very solid freelance business doing this. But when you want to grow beyond that, when you want to build a team, when you want to, make extra money, to kind of like fund that growth, you need a system here, which comes down to, okay, if I just, as a freelancer, if I sit around and do good work, eventually, clients end up trickling in through different means. But there's no system where I can do something and be like, I get clients from this thing. It just, they sporadically come in from all over the place. What you kind of need to scale beyond that point is some form of funnel, which comes from that top of funnel awareness. Like, how do people know what it is that you do? But then you kind of need a pipeline, like a CRM of, okay, these people know what I do, or maybe I'm even reaching out to people. I need some form of input that eventually leads to a sale. So I feel like the easiest thing people like to equate this to is people who run businesses where they maybe sell through email. Let's say it's like a course or something they sell through email. They essentially know that for every 1,000 email subscribers I get, 5 or 10 people convert. As a freelancer, as a service business, I feel like most people have no process here. It's not like for every, 100 outbound emails or whatever the strategy is I send, I end up getting a client. And on like a one-by-one basis, this doesn't always map. You can send out 100 emails and maybe not get a client. But if you send out, I don't know, 10,000 emails, it'll equal out to, every 100 emails you'll get a client. It in the kind of like cold email space. Now, it's not something I've ever actually tried yet at the minute, like still something we're kind of exploring, the cold email side of things. But actually having some form of method, whether that's outreach on LinkedIn and social media. Obviously, there's posting on social media, which is a very big part of this, kind of just increasing that exposure. And then having some form of system where you can input something which eventually leads to getting a client. I feel like that's a thing that a lot of people, especially the kind of people who are freelancers who prefer doing the work than doing the building of the freelance business. I think a lot of time people will struggle with that. Like they won't know who it is that they want to work with. It'll be very kind of scattered and kind of like things will just trickle in whenever they trickle in.
This all makes sense, but what is your funnel? Talk to me about how you came to, you've realized that this is a problem. Now, what do you do that takes sales more seriously?
Yeah, so the very first part with this is having an ICP, like your customer profile, essentially. And that can be like multiple types of company, but for us, it's typically startups. Now, when we say startups, it doesn't necessarily just mean tech companies. I feel like in the past, I used to get that like blurred a bit. Ultimately, I just like the company, just like working with companies who are relatively like early-ish stage and they're growing. But this can mean that they are slightly like larger companies, if they're getting towards like raising money, like even some enterprise companies. That's the kind of thing where we're looking for a company who's looking for like a high trajectory, because this is the kind of company where their website is going to be very important and it kind of fits our model. So then that means that we have two types of people who we would likely kind of get the attention of, who would want to work with us. The first is the founder of the company. So that's, founder, co-founder, a decision maker, especially early on. They're making all the decisions. The other is the CMO or the VP of marketing, the top dog in the marketing team. They are like the two kind of main decision makers who ultimately would decide, we're going to work with this agency, we're going to work with Demandflow, and here's the reasons we're going to work with them. So that's the very first piece, is like, how do we get in front of them? The social media side, more than anything, it's just trying to get awareness and try to understand that, okay, how do you get in front of a lot of people? One thing that we've been doing recently is like prospecting through LinkedIn. Now, LinkedIn gets a lot of hate because it's a very cringy platform, and I'm not a big fan of going on LinkedIn and consuming content on LinkedIn, but LinkedIn is like an absolute goldmine because you see exactly who works at these different companies and what role they work in. So what we've been doing a lot recently is finding, okay, here is the types of companies that we want to work with. We can find these through a bunch of different sources. There's all kinds of things you can do to find your kind of like ideal companies that you'd want to work with. But for us, we have a very kind of defined target of, okay, they're probably going to be a company who's raised some money, startup, likely in that early-ish stage, let's say from like pre-seed, seed, Series A, Series B is likely when we'll start to work with them. For us, the way we kind of see this journey is like, there is a company we started working with as a freelancer like myself at pre-seed stage. This was before they raised any money. I started working with them. They're now just raising their Series A. The ideal thing is we're just going to keep going as this venture-backed company. They just keep growing and we keep growing with them. That's the way we kind of see this. So if we can get in with them and continue to grow with them, it works really well. So on LinkedIn with this outreach, what we do is I would find these people, and in my CRM, like I use a tool called Attio, which is like a kind of, we have a pipeline CRM. I can add these people on LinkedIn, just like send a connection request. Now, there's a person that I talked to a little while back, and she presented a really good way, because cold emails and cold messages, they feel like they take a lot of time to do it personally. It's just a lot of effort, and it kind of feels a bit like, I don't know, just like a bit cringe, to be honest. I don't know why, but like it's very, very salesy. Same with cold emails, cold message on LinkedIn. So instead, what we do is just send a connection request. If that person decides, okay, I'm going to accept this person's connection request, then that means they looked at my profile, they looked at that as a landing page, and they decided, you know what, I want this person in my kind of sphere of people I connect with on LinkedIn. At that point, then I'll send them a message, because they have opted in to being contacted by me. Like, it's almost like they've done some form of action that said, okay, they've opted in, like, we can then just start a conversation. I'm not hard pitching Like I almost never hard pitch anyone, because when someone wants to build a website, it's not just like £29 purchase. It's not a small thing. It is a big thing to commit to working with someone. So the biggest thing is like this overarching, how do you have top of funnel so people know what it is that you do? And then how do you start to build connections with people who are in these specific roles who would actually work with you, or they'd recommend you to someone else who is, founders are likely to talk to other founders. CMOs are likely to talk to other CMOs. Like if they spot your stuff, they see the quality of your work. It's all this very long-term game that eventually just like starts to, you build like a flywheel. It's very hard to get the flywheel to initially start moving, but when it starts moving, it's very hard to get that flywheel to stop. And that is often how you see a lot of these larger agencies. It all kind of comes from getting that flywheel to move in the beginning. So they need some form of system. Now, there's other things we tried as well, and like we're kind of testing stuff, like cold email may be something we do in future. I know a lot of agencies build very, very well with cold email. You can send out so many different cold emails, and all you're trying to do is start a conversation. All you're trying to do is get someone on a call and figure out if they have a problem, can we help solve their problem? That is kind of where we think about this whole like sales and marketing. Then obviously closing the sale is defining what is the problem, how can we help the company, or can we help the company? And then you make the sale on the back end of that.
Very comprehensive. Makes a ton of sense. Kind of gives me cold sweats. The idea of CRM, just that acronym gives me a bit of a. But I do think, maybe that's a me thing rather than, it's actually an icky thing. Maybe it's just like a necessary part of trying to grow an agency with a particular type of target market in mind.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. It's like it's just being intentional about stuff and having a system in place. And I was exactly the same. Like I have a couple of friends who run a video agency. Their video agencies, it must be kind of closing on like $2 million revenue a year now. They did not do any of this stuff initially, but when they started doing all this stuff and like hired an operator to help out with all these things, their company just grew like crazy because they actually did all the things that the other companies do. And, if you don't want to grow to a huge size company, like I don't have any aspirations to be like the largest agency in the world. If you have a system, you can then have like an excess of inbound leads and an excess of people who want to work with you. I would much rather have a problem of abundance, a problem of too many people wanting to work with you and having to say no or continue to increase your prices, than the problem of scarcity where you're like, oh, I have no one to work with. Like I'm kind of struggling to pay the bills here.
Yeah, you're right, Stephen. I should have a better system than just kind of talking about what I do in social media posts. But a clearer idea of is the input equaling the output. It's a very, very fair point.
I think the social media piece as well is like, I don't know about you, but like I at least find with social media that people see your content, they maybe see some good work you've done, or maybe see some interesting things that you talk about. They'll kind of think of you as like, oh, this is a person who does design and Webflow development. But the actual conversion happens in the DMs. So, people can be posting on social media and they have good reach. But if they're not actually talking to people, it doesn't really like, they have the top of funnel, but they're not moving it to the point of like, oh, I'm actually having a conversation with someone. And the best thing, and as much as like it can be kind of like the worst thing for a freelancer, the best thing is just to get on a call with someone, because then you can solve what the problem is. I think you mentioned this when we were talking like a little bit earlier. You mentioned this idea of like selling time. If you read things like Naval Ravikant's the Almanac of Naval, and a lot of these things, he'll talk about not selling your time and like not doing calls and all this kind of stuff. That's great if you're a billionaire who has done all this stuff and you've got to the point where like you can do that stuff. But in the beginning, selling your time is it's a great way to make a lot of money. Like you can, if you have a valuable skill and you charge, I don't know, like a day rate or something as a freelancer in the beginning, it's a great way to make a lot of money. And if you need to get more clients, a great way to figure out what problems clients have is to just get on calls with them and talk to them about the thing that you do. And I know a lot of people don't necessarily like calls and all that kind of stuff, but the way I've like shifted from when I initially started over to how I think about this stuff now, I initially used to be like, oh, I don't want to talk to a client because it's me doing sales. But now I very much see it as like, I'm having a conversation with someone. This person, the reason they started this conversation is because they have a problem. So all I'm going to talk to them about is, here's your problem. Here's how we could help to solve the problem. Or here's maybe we can't help to solve the problem. Here's who would help to solve the problem. That's the only thing you're trying to do here, is figure out, can you help them? If you can, how do you help them? And then you kind of move from there in terms of like moving on to a proposal and stuff.
Yeah, makes a ton of sense. It's a mindset shift, and I need to do it. And if anyone else is listening who's like, I didn't CRM, really? Do I want to do that? Maybe you don't want to do that because you have got a perspective of what that is rather than maybe what it is in reality. Tell me about failure number 3, focus, focus, focus.
Yeah. So when I was a freelancer, let's say I got to about 2.5 years in, I was doing very well as a freelancer, and especially from the position I kind of came from. Like I at this point, I was still living with my parents. I lived very kind of rural North Yorkshire, like very small, sleepy town. And the business in terms of revenue was doing very well. Say like we're kind of hitting way more money than it had before. At that point, I was just like, I kind of lost focus. So I wasn't trying to grow the freelance business. I wasn't really trying to get more clients. I was just exploring with these ideas of like trying to do different things, like trying to do YouTube and trying to, do all of these different kind of projects I wanted to build. And at this point, I got just like very kind of comfortable. But the problem that I kind of hit at this point where I got very comfortable was that I didn't kind of solidify my freelance career, like the amount of people that knew me and knew my value in terms of the things that I could do, to the point where I had excess offers. I kind of got to the point where I was like, oh, well, I had a couple of months where a decent amount of money came in. Like, I feel like I'm a big shot at this point. Like, I feel like, done these big projects, like, look at me doing all this kind of stuff. But at that point, I just kind of lost focus. And I wasn't like, okay, but, it's not always going to be exactly like this. There's going to be times where things change. You need to kind of like build your career and like consistently become the kind of person who has all these opportunities. You look at some like large designers like Dan Petty, he could take some time off from designing, but he has a huge audience and all these kind of things. People are still going to want to work with him in a year's time. But when you're just getting started and you have a few wins, celebrating those wins like on a small margin, completely fine. But then getting to the point where you're like, oh, this is just me for life now, is not a very good way to approach things, because it's all about like who knows your value and what positions are those people in. And this is a point where I very much kind of took my eye off the ball. I tried it in a bunch of different things. So I tried YouTube, that video editing agency I mentioned earlier. I actually worked with them for a period of time. Like I was taking over as like running their company. That didn't kind of fit with my skill set. As I mentioned before as well, like I worked with Matt Diavella. We launched this newsletter. I did my own newsletter. All this stuff is great in terms of learning. But in terms of the freelance business, I think what I should have done, if I was to go back right now, was solidify my career as a freelancer and like the amount of people who know me and like the specializing in a skill.
In web design and web development.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because at that point, I'd have been further along and had much more ability to do all of these other things, but I had some more kind of wins under my belt. It was more of the idea of like, oh, things are going great, I'm going to go do some other stuff.
I think there's this kind of natural, get a win, cool, I'm going to try out loads of stuff. And then you come back to the thing that you originally were doing to be like, God, I was kind of an idiot there. Like, I won't be able to do all the other things that I want to do unless I do this one thing that originally got me the first win, but even better than I have. I've certainly found that you kind of, you have this like, I'm amazing. And then life just comes around and twats you with a cricket bat. Like, bang, okay, you're not where you thought you were. So...
And I think with this kind of idea of focus, I'm sure a lot of people, there's probably two archetypes in this like freelance Webflow kind of agency and also like in-house space. There's the one kind of archetype is the person who wants to just be really, really good at the thing that they're doing. They probably don't actually struggle as much with focus. So let's say they want to be in-house and they want to be a developer, or they want to be a designer, or they want to do both. They're probably very likely very good at focusing on just doing that thing because that's what they want to do. They maybe don't want to do all the freelancing and building the business stuff. So they can just focus and like lock in on doing that thing. But then there's the person who's the freelancer, maybe the entrepreneur, the person who's interested in like a million different things. And, this person probably has the skills inside of web design and Webflow development as to how they got into this position. But their problem is shiny object syndrome. It's kind of, you only have so much attention, but you want to do everything. And that has been my kind of reality. I've tried to do all these different things, which has slowed me down developing in one space. It's great on the very long scale where you're like, oh, I'm now in a position where I have a few different things that I'm like decent at. But if you want to get really good at something, just locking in and focusing on that thing for like a period of time. I always call these like life seasons essentially. So it's like, okay, this season I'm focused on this thing. Then I switch over to another season. And there's this kind of idea of your life is like a gas stove, and the amount of gas coming through that stove is always the same. You can turn one up, but that means you need to turn these other areas of your life down. And that kind of like coincides a lot with living life in seasons. It's like, if you just want to focus on building a business, you need to turn that stove up a little bit and turn some of the other stuff down. And that kind of like all pulls together to this kind of idea that if you want to do something, you do really need to just lock in on what that thing is.
Beautiful way to end this episode. Are you ready for the most difficult question I've asked you so far?
I am.
You don't sound sure. Tell me about what your next failure is going to be.
Next failure will likely be in trying to scale the agency. I've already kind of experienced some of this where you're trying to juggle all the pieces of getting more people in. So you need more clients, but you also need like the team members to do the work. So the next failure, and I know this will happen and it'll continue to happen, I just need to not be so reactive in the moment, will be this kind of imbalance between we have too much work, but not enough people to fulfill the work. And we're like overstretched to the point where maybe at some points we have too many people and not enough work. So the next failure will be figuring out how to balance these different things together, build a team and keep our quality very, very high. Because that's the one thing for me that I'm just like, if there's no point in doing this if we're not doing this really, really well, and no one will continue to want to work with us if we're not doing this really, really well. So yeah, keeping quality high while balancing those two sides, that'll be the next failure that hits pretty much every day until kind of come through the other side.
Deciding which knob to turn up on the gas stove at the right time to make sure everything cooks evenly. Stephen, you've been an incredible guest. Thank you so much for coming on the Webflow podcast and sharing as vulnerably as you have.
Thank you very much for having me.